A month ago, if you questioned my belief in supernatural occurrences and the paranormal, I would have regarded you as if you had just escaped from a mental institution, responding with a short, mocking dismissal. No, never, I'd have said. I never believed in ghosts, vampires, werewolves, or any other mysterious explanations for the unexplained sounds and sightings. I lived comfortably in my skepticism, blissfully unaware. I understand that it might be challenging for you to accept, assuming you're anything like I was just 7 days ago. I won't sit here and swear that every word is irrefutably true because you probably won't believe me anyway. It would be a waste of both our time. But it is true. I want to share my story, if for no other reason than to free my mind from its grip. Perhaps, by putting it into writing, distancing myself from it in some way, it will seem less real and more like a dream or a story. Then, maybe I can read it and find amusement in it, as if it happened to someone else, not me. However, I'm afraid. What will happen if I reveal what I know? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for humanity? What if I speak out and, as a consequence, everyone I've ever cared about is wiped out, on top of all the losses I've already endured? Can I truly take that risk? But I believe I must. First, if I remain silent, I'll need to be confined to a straitjacket and a padded cell to stay alive, given the amount of hair I've lost due to fear, anxiety, and trauma. Second, if I don't speak out, humanity will slowly perish, and no one will be the wiser. Well, perhaps that's not entirely accurate. Eventually, someone will figure it out, just as I have, and they'll shout from the rooftops, but they'll be silenced before their message spreads. It's a never-ending cycle, and it won't stop. They will find me too, but I've come to terms with what I'm about to do. I believe now, and with that belief comes the acceptance of my impending demise. By sharing this story, I know I'm signing my own death warrant, but it doesn't matter. Death is preferable to insanity, to the dark knowledge clawing at my mind. Knowing that revealing what I've seen and know might save others' lives, I consider it worth the risk. I believe. The building stood there, an ugly, long, squat structure, next to a rarely traveled back road about 10 miles outside the city limits. It was an old building, perhaps a barn at one point, but it was hard to discern its original purpose. The wooden facade had been painted a vivid blood red with black trim. I drove this road semi-regularly, connecting my city home with my parents' small farm in the countryside, and the building served as a halfway marker for me. Until recently, it had been unremarkable, with weathered, warped wooden sides blending into the natural surroundings of trees, brush, and large rocks. It was just another old building in the Tennessee woods. However, during a visit to my parents, I approached the gentle curve in the road and was startled to see the freshly painted, glaring red building. I gasped, taken aback by the transformation. It couldn't have been more than 2 days since my last visit, and I was returning to retrieve my forgotten iPad. My mother had suggested, while you're coming, you might as well stay for dinner. I'm preparing a roast. My mom's roast has never been turned down. I hastily pulled over by the road, opposite the freshly painted building, and took a moment to gaze at it. While the wood still displayed some warping, it seemed to have undergone significant structural improvements. Additionally, the few windows the building had were apparently painted black to match the trim. It's peculiar, I mumbled, observing the windows. Another oddity was the neon open sign flashing next to the black painted door. I didn't have time to ponder it further, as I was already running late and didn't want to upset my mother. So, I resumed my journey, leaving the building behind. In the following weeks, during my trips to and from my parents' house, I noticed continuous renovations at the long building nestled in the woods. A corrugated metal roof, a small entrance portico, and a gravel parking lot bordered by massive boulders appeared to have been added. Except for its red color, the building managed to blend seamlessly with the natural surroundings, both appearing new and aged. This evolution piqued my curiosity as I drove back and forth, and I took pleasure in observing its transformation. However, I never spotted anyone working on it, nor did I see any equipment. I marveled at the idea of moving those boulders without heavy machinery, but my fascination with the building remained just that, a curiosity. My daily routine was monotonous: work, occasional outings with colleagues, and quiet evenings at home. My life felt stagnant, and I yearned for something different. Then, during one visit to my parents, I noticed cars, pickup trucks, and motorcycles in the parking lot of the red building in the woods, its open sign flashing brightly in the gathering dusk. I couldn't help but wonder about the nature of the new establishment. Over dinner that evening, my parents and I discussed it. Mom had made scratch-made fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and sautéed vegetables from her garden, but neither of them had any information about the building. My dad had merely noticed its existence, and that was the extent of his knowledge. "Haven't heard a thing," he admitted. Mom voiced her concerns, speculating it might be a biker bar and predicting potential trouble in the area. However, I couldn't add much to the conversation, so we finished our meal in silence. After helping with the cleanup, I headed home that night and, as I passed the building, an unsettling feeling crept over me. I couldn't pinpoint it immediately, but the structure gave me an uneasy vibe in the darkness. I kept my eyes on it as I drove past, only letting it disappear from view when the road curved. Upon arriving home, I felt somewhat foolish. In the well-lit comfort of my small apartment, I scolded myself for my earlier apprehension, dismissing it as baseless paranoia. I mentally berated myself before preparing for bed. The next morning, my mother called me at the office, which was unusual. She shared her observation about the building in the woods and how it had become the center of police activity, complete with yellow caution tape. She didn't know the details, but felt that the situation couldn't be good, given the police presence. I expressed my concern, and she reassured me that she was safe, but advised me to be cautious when I visited them next. She expressed her love and abruptly ended the call. I anticipated that she would quickly dial her best friends Gladys and Merle to indulge in some gossip. I refocused on my tasks, almost forgetting our conversation. A week later, my mother called again, mentioning she was making my favorite supper and inviting me over to join them. Her tone carried a hint of tension, and I found no reason to decline, so I gladly accepted the invitation. I eagerly anticipated her mouth-watering barbecue spare ribs. The dinner turned out to be exceptional, as always. I marveled at how my mom's baked ribs tasted as if they had just come off a charcoal grill. Alongside her homemade macaroni and cheese and a selection of fresh vegetables from her garden, it was a truly satisfying meal. I adored my mother's cooking, but I couldn't help but notice her pallor, red splotches on her cheeks, and dark circles under her eyes. She appeared unwell, though she assured me repeatedly that she was merely fatigued, attributing it to her extensive involvement with the Ladies' Auxiliary and the upcoming fall fundraiser. Even her usually sparkling blue eyes looked watery and paler than usual. I took my father aside to inquire about her condition. He echoed my mother's story about the fundraiser and her sleep troubles, mentioning that she'd been plagued by bad dreams. With a stern voice and a direct gaze, I suggested that if this continued, she should see a doctor. He nodded in agreement, acknowledging the concern. A day later, police were surrounding my parents' house, with yellow tape cordoning off the area. My father sat in the back of a police car, sobbing, while the coroner transported my mother's lifeless body to the van. The police questioned my father but didn't suspect any wrongdoing on his part. They were trying to unravel the mystery of what had transpired. I stood by my father's side, attempting to provide comfort with my presence but struggling to hold back my own grief. My father explained to the officers that she had simply not woken up. They had gone to bed as usual, and despite her feeling unwell, she had insisted she was fine. The officers offered their condolences, and we thanked them as they left. My father and I embraced, both of us crying, feeling the immense loss of my mother. Her absence left a void in my heart, an emptiness that seemed immeasurable. I could only imagine the depths of my father's grief. Without consulting him, I made the decision to move back home for a few days, offering my support during this difficult time. My father seemed appreciative, though he didn't explicitly express it, as he was a man of few words. I took a brief bereavement leave from work, and together, we grappled with the situation, including the planning of her funeral. I won't dwell on the funeral, it was too painful to recount. Suffice it to say that between my father and me, and with the attendance of numerous mourners, my mother was laid to rest amidst a sea of tears and a field of sunflowers. Following the ceremony, our small farmhouse was inundated with well-meaning visitors bearing casseroles and pies, offering their assistance, which we accepted with numb gratitude. We engaged in awkward conversations that we would later struggle to recall in any great detail, finding solace in each other's company. My father and I had always shared a strong bond. He guided me through the ins and outs of farm work, teaching me how to handle every piece of equipment and even how to milk the few cows we owned. He kept me busy with various chores and tasks, and whenever I complained, he would flash a wry grin and say, "Son, I'm just building your character. You'll thank me someday." When I was 12, he taught me how to drive, taking a few laps around the vast back field, making me feel like I was on cloud nine. None of my school friends could drive, so I even handled the tractor. My dad wasn't much of a talker, but when he did speak, I listened. His kindness and gentleness said more than any words ever could. He never uttered "I love you," but it was evident in every action he took. I never once doubted his love for me. I considered myself fortunate to grow up with two loving parents, especially when so many of my peers came from broken families. However, everything changed about 4 or 5 days after my mother's funeral. My dad told me, "Joey, you need to go back home. You have to keep living, and there's no need to babysit your old man." I argued, insisting that I wanted to stay, and I genuinely did. But he practically pushed me out the door, firmly declaring, "I didn't argue with your mama, and I sure as heck won't argue with you. Now, get going." That was it, I was dismissed. Although I worried about him at the farmhouse alone, I couldn't deny that I was relieved to return to my mundane life in town. Every minute at the farmhouse only added to my grief, which was consuming me. On my way home, I passed by the old red building as usual and once again felt that something was amiss about the place. I brushed off the feeling, too preoccupied with my grief. Life settled into a new, albeit troubled, normal. My dad and I spoke on the phone every day, but we both knew we were living lies. The loss of my wife and mother was too immense. Then, about 2 months after my mom's passing, I couldn't reach my dad. I made several calls throughout the day, growing increasingly anxious with each unanswered ring. Finally, at 5 o'clock, I abruptly left my desk and hurried toward the exit. An irresistible urge drove me to the farmhouse. You could call it a gut feeling. I don't think I need to explain what I discovered. I didn't have to, but I buried my father next to my mother, less than 2 months after her funeral. His favorite work gloves and a rustic bunch of wildflowers replaced the tears and sunflowers that were there for my mom. I stood there in a daze as the grave diggers filled the hole that now held my father's casket. When I had gathered myself enough, I let grief wash over me. After the hole was filled and the cemetery workers had departed, darkness was closing in. I won't bore you with the day-to-day details. I inherited the farmhouse, my parents' modest savings, the equipment, the land, and the animals. Reluctantly, I had to part with many pieces of my childhood. It was simply impossible to manage the farm and keep my job. So, I sold off parcels of land, most of the equipment, the animals, and more until I felt I could sustain myself there and tend to the places my parents would have wanted me to. I continued commuting into the city for work. It was only a 30-minute drive, after all. After discussing it with my landlord, I broke my lease without any issues and moved into the farmhouse permanently. My first night alone in the farmhouse was a mix of bittersweet memories from my childhood. I wandered through the house, touching the banister and recalling the time I had slid down it and ended up with a broken ankle. My fingers brushed the wooden paneling in the front hallway, and I remembered the small closet under the stairs that had served as my secret fort for many years. My parents always knew where to find me. Nestled within the concealed recesses, amidst the secret stash of pillows and blankets, I would often find myself engrossed in my own world, either lost in a book or engrossed in play with my action figures. On opening that petite door, I came across a sight that evoked a rush of memories. It was the very door on which, at the age of 10, I had carved my name. The little room exuded the same familiar scent, precisely unchanged. These memories flooded my senses, prompting me to wander through the house as I reacquainted myself with the feeling of permanent residence. Gradually, I began contemplating improvements, and time marched on. Then, one night, approximately 4 months after my father's passing and 6 months after my mother's, I was lying in bed. I had taken over the master bedroom, its windows offering a view of the front yard. As I read a book on coding, I started to doze off when a commotion from the yard below caught my attention. The chickens I had kept were in a frenzy, squawking and flapping their wings in distress. Peering out of my window, I expected to spot a fox or a coyote, both known threats to my chickens. However, what I saw was a man, cloaked in dark attire, standing directly beneath my bedroom window. His eyes were unnaturally radiant as they locked onto mine. My heart raced, and shock held me captive. I closed my eyes in disbelief, hoping that he would disappear when I opened them. To my relief, he was gone. That night, the nightmares began, relentless and recurring, filled with gruesome scenes of blood and death, yet strangely alluring. I would wake drenched in cold sweat, trembling, torn between horror and longing. I could never recall the specifics of the dreams, only that they were terrifying, with the red building in the woods as a recurring motif. Thoughts of that red building and the nightmares began to consume my nights, robbing me of sleep. I would battle to stay awake, only to drift into a surreal dreamscape filled with music and a beckoning voice in the mist, my mother's voice. "Joey," she would say, and though I couldn't see her face, I recognized her voice. "Joey, everything's going to be all right. Your father's here now, too, and everything's going to be all right." It was sweet to hear her voice again, but it also unsettled me. Something about it bothered me deeply. Every night, I struggled to stay awake, hoping to escape the familiar but disconcerting voice. Then, one night, it all became clear. I jolted upright from sleep, suddenly realizing what had been unsettling me. My mother didn't speak like that. She had a distinctive way of enunciating her words. She'd say everything instead of everything, gonna instead of going to, and fine instead of all right. I was furious with myself. My own educated mind was distorting my memory of my mother. It was her voice, no doubt, but not as she would speak to me. She was a true country girl, raised on lard, butter, biscuits, hard work, and prayer, and I yearned to hear her voice the way she truly spoke. This became another tormenting aspect of the already haunting nightmares, one I couldn't overcome. Soon, the dreams took a different turn. I would climb out of my bedroom window, leap from the second story to the brown grass below, agile and graceful, and run for miles to the red building in the woods. Arriving there, I would stand before the flashing open sign, reach for the door, and then wake up drenched in sweat, trembling in my bed. I attributed these dreams to grief and allowed them to persist for an extended period. However, my coworkers began commenting on my tired appearance, and it took weeks before I connected the dots. My current pallid face, marked by red splotches and dark circles under my eyes, mirrored the same look my mother had just 2 days before her passing. I hadn't seen my father for a few days before I found him lifeless, but I suspected he would have had a similar ashen complexion with ghostly roses in his cheeks and coal-like shadows beneath his eyes. Sleep deprivation was the only plausible explanation. I sought medical advice, and the doctor declared me generally healthy, though slightly anemic. He prescribed a sleeping pill, and when I questioned him about the anemia, he explained that it was quite common, especially for those not sleeping or eating properly, pointing to the 20+ pounds I had lost since my last visit shortly before my mother's demise. "See," he stated calmly, "just give the sleeping pill a try. I've prescribed a very low dosage so you can gauge its effects. Some folks find this amount sufficient. If it works, that's excellent. If not, let's schedule a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks. All right?" "Yeah," I replied, taking the prescription from him. "Oh, and Joe, make sure to increase your food intake. You're getting a bit too thin. Incorporate iron-rich foods into your diet, It'll help with your anemia. Spinach, beans, you know, those kinds of things. You can prepare them or... Hold on, he reached behind him. Here, take this. He handed me a brochure titled The Iron-Rich Diet. Now, I wasn't too keen on the idea of the sleeping pills, and even though I was exhausted, I felt that taking them might not be the right move. I wasn't sure I was that desperate just yet. However, that night, in my dreams, my mother's voice reassured me, "It's going to be all right now, Joey. Your father is here too. He agrees with me. Take the pill, Joey." Needless to say, I spent the rest of the night awake. A few days later, my supervisor, Kevin, called me into his office. He suggested that I take some time off, maybe head to the beach for some rest. I resisted, claiming I was fine. "Joe, you're not fine, and you know it," he said. "Your work is slipping, and I need you at your best. The accuracy of our accounts relies on your data. Take some time to rest away from here, all right?" "Okay," I mumbled, feeling hollow. As I turned to leave, he added, "You'll be all right, Joe. It's grief, it messes with us. It makes us feel and do things we wouldn't normally do or forget to do. Grief is tough, Joe. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Just remember, I'm here for you, boss or not. I'm still your friend, Joe." Oddly, I felt better. "Thanks," I said and laughed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was holding me back from just taking off to the Bahamas for a week. It wasn't a question of money, it was something else. I wondered if it was grief. I drove home in a daze, the sun still shining brightly. I took the curves in the road by rote, pondering my options. Lost in thought, I rounded a curve and was startled by the sight of a red neon sign flashing "Open, open, open." Without much thought, I pulled into the gravel parking lot. There were a few cars and motorcycles parked, not as busy as I'd seen it before. I sat in my car, contemplating why I was there. I wasn't even sure what this place was, but the vague recollection of my father mentioning it as a biker bar with beer made me crave a drink more than ever. Without further thought, I left the car and walked slowly to the entrance of the red building in the woods. I reached for the doorknob and turned it, pushing the wooden door open. What I saw inside made me freeze. 6 men sat at the bar, all turning to stare at me simultaneously, a disconcerting sight. The bartender, a tall woman with long, sleek black hair and cat-like eyes, also turned to look at me, interrupting her cleaning of a freshly washed glass. It was clear that I was an outsider, and my father had been right. It was indeed a biker bar. The patrons all sported black leather pants, some with leather jackets or vests, while others wore jean jackets. Each rugged face hadn't seen a razor in months. The bartender, who seemed taken aback by my entrance as her patrons were, was the first to break the silence. "Easy, boys," she said in a honey-like voice. Then, looking at me, she said, "Well, come on in, stranger. Want a beer?" Her eyes glinted with subtle amusement. Hesitatingly, I replied, "Yes, more than I've ever wanted anything else in my life." I entered the room and closed the door behind me, proceeding cautiously towards the bar. The group of men, who had previously eyed me with hostility, now observed me with less animosity. The woman with a soothing voice, akin to honey, had already poured a beer for me and had it ready when I selected a seat a few stools away from another patron, naturally maintaining my distance. With her honey-like voice, the woman asked, "So, what brings you to the Red Barn today?" I foolishly responded, "The Red Barn?" She gestured around the establishment, saying, "You're sitting in it, slick." "The Red Barn." Feeling somewhat foolish, I replied, "Oh well," not eager to divulge my life story to a group of strangers. The man to my right, in a deep, gravelly voice, without looking at me, stated, "This is where we come to share all our secrets, son." His words had a strangely hypnotic quality, prompting me to share my recent struggles, my mother's passing, my father's demise, the farm, sleepless nights, haunting nightmares, and the forced break from work. As I fell silent, I took a deep breath and downed my entire beer in a single gulp. When I looked up, The bartender had already placed another glass in front of me, and the men at the bar were leaning in, their eyes hungry but devoid of sympathy. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I couldn't understand my emotions. Miss Voice, sounding like Connie, said, "Geez, Slick, that's quite a rough time you've had." Her eyes, too, seemed strangely hungry. My nervous chuckle was met with the man to my right, who got up, came over, and draped his arm around my shoulder. His voice, like stone, resonated hypnotically. "Well, sorry, man, that just sucks. Let's get a drink." My nerves dissipated, and I agreed, "Yeah, let's get a drink." Before I knew it, tequila was flowing faster than I'd ever experienced, and I was thoroughly intoxicated in under 30 seconds. The bartender teasingly remarked, "Man, you're a lightweight," as I struggled to stop the room from spinning. I grinned foolishly and asked, "What's your name?" She replied, "Honey, my name's Vanessa, though folks usually call me Nessa." I slurred, "That's a nice name, Nessa." The man with the gravelly voice chimed in, "My name's Stone." I chuckled, and he looked at me, somewhat offended. I stammered, "No, it's just your voice, it's like gravel, so your name fits." Speaking was getting increasingly difficult. Drunk me felt content and declared, "You're my new best friend." Then, I passed out with my head on the bar. When I woke up, I had a terrible headache, and my stomach felt queasy. I groaned, never having been this drunk in my life. I fell back into unconsciousness, not caring where I was, just wanting to sleep it off. The next time I awoke, I felt slightly better but still headachy and nauseous. I was at home, in my farmhouse, in my own bed, and I noticed my car in the front yard. I couldn't have driven home in that state, so someone, possibly Stone or another guy, must have brought me home. I felt embarrassed and grateful, though something nagged at the back of my mind, a vague, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite recall. I attributed it to the effects of alcohol and tentatively got out of bed. On her upper right arm, she had a tattoo, but I lacked the familiarity to inquire about her body modifications. Furthermore, it wasn't my place to question her choices. So, I quietly sipped my beer, watching Nessa skillfully manage the bar, taking and fulfilling orders with a mesmerizing rhythm. I hadn't been there for long when I felt the familiar embrace of a leather-clad arm around my shoulders. It was Stone. "I thought you might return, Joe." "How are you feeling?" he asked in a friendly tone. "Yeah," I replied, "I definitely overindulged last night. I'm still dealing with a hangover. But, at least, I didn't vomit up my internal organs, and I managed to have a somewhat productive day thinking about my trip to Home Depot. Thanks for driving me home, by the way." Stone reassured me, "No problem at all. Just making sure you got home safely. Chuck followed me to your place so I'd have a ride back." "Chuck?" I inquired. "Yes, Chuck," Stone said, pointing to a guy at the other end of the bar who had been there yesterday. Chuck grinned, raised his glass, and took a deep sip. "Right," I said weakly, "thanks again." "So, up for round 2? Stone asked. "No way," I told him earnestly, and his laughter drew the attention of the whole room, causing my cheeks to turn pink with embarrassment. Stone reassured me, "No worries at all, friend." He nodded at Nessa and moved to another part of the room to talk to a redhead who had signaled him. I finished my beer and left enough money on the counter to cover the drink and the tip. I caught Nessa's eye and silently expressed my gratitude. She understood and conveyed a wordless farewell. I headed home that night, but the recurring nightmare was stronger than ever. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up with a scream, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I couldn't recall what had triggered the dream, just vague, bloody, and horrifying images, with the only clear element being the red building in the woods. As my heart gradually returned to a normal rhythm, I heard the chickens in the yard squawking and flapping frantically. Peering out the window, I once again saw dark figures in the yard, their silver eyes gleaming. This time, I didn't close my eyes, but rather observed them, taking in their casual posture, dark attire, and pale faces hidden by hoods. I vaguely recognized one of them, but my memory failed me. My head hurts, Joey, my mother's voice suddenly echoed. Was I still dreaming? I turned around and saw both my parents standing at the foot of my bed. Joey, my mom called again. Mom? Dad, what's going on? I asked, bewildered and anxious. Everything will be fine, Joey, my father reassured me. Your mother and I are here. Joey, will you come with us? We have something wonderful to show you. Without waiting for my response, they turned and gracefully exited the bedroom. I scrambled out of bed, trying to keep up with them, utterly perplexed. They were supposed to be dead, yet I was following them, both alive, down the stairs, and out the front door. The figure in the yard became a distant memory, only returning to my attention when it lunged at me as soon as I set foot on the front porch. That was the last thing I remembered. When I regained consciousness, I was in a dimly lit room, lying on a cot. The room reeked of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and vomit, and I could hear groaning from others who had evidently been here before. I supported my throbbing head with my hands and attempted to sit up. I had no idea where I was, but the smell and surroundings suggested I was not the first to find myself in this situation. The room appeared to be no larger than a prison cell, perhaps 4 by 6 feet, with only a toilet, a sink, and a cot. The walls were painted black concrete blocks, and the feeble light seeped through a blacked-out window, with some paint scratched off, likely by previous occupants in distress. A knock on the door startled me, causing me to yelp in surprise. The door swung open, revealing Nessa. Good, you're awake, she said with her honeyed voice, but a new icy edge I hadn't heard before. I struggled to my feet and asked, what's happening? She didn't respond to any of my questions and continued walking, with me following her. I repeated my question, but she remained silent. She led me through the barn, which was now devoid of patrons. Stone sat in a dark corner, his face obscured by shadows, but I knew it was him. I suddenly realized he had been the figure in the front yard, staring up at my bedroom. I felt disoriented, confused, frightened, and, most notably, angry. Oh, Joe, Stone said gravely from his shadowy seat. Don't get too agitated. It won't end well for you. After all, we're friends, right? I didn't respond and kept a watchful eye on him, while also trying to keep Nessa in my peripheral vision. She was gradually circling behind me, which made me exceedingly uncomfortable. I bet you're wondering why you're here, Stone grumbled. I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. He chuckled, his laughter devoid of mirth. Well, actually, I'm going to kill you anyway. But since you're here, and since you've been so amicable, I thought I'd explain it before I end you. What did I ever do to you? I asked, suddenly feeling courageous. If he was going to kill me regardless, I might as well provoke him. Oh, you didn't do anything, Joe, Stone replied casually. I just like you, see? You're fun, and I'd like to have you around for the next millennium. Nessa would like that too. He grinned wickedly in her direction, revealing his sharp teeth, which hadn't been a hallucination. I could hear Nessa's exasperated sigh to my left. She was nearly behind me now, making me feel increasingly uncomfortable. So, here's the deal, Joe, Stone continued. I want your house. It's close to this place, and it's just perfect for us. We're going to take it from you. We offered your mother the same choice. She was an easy target. A little mental suggestion, a few nightmares, and she essentially took her own life. Really? She had a weak heart, didn't you know? Well, I'm sure there were many things your parents never told you. You can ask them later. They're in the back. He grinned again, causing goosebumps to spread across my skin. Daddy was distraught and pined away for your mom until he, too, was ours for the taking. A few unsettling nightmares, one remarkably surreal hallucination, and whoops, those stairs suddenly became an obstacle that tripped him. Unfortunately for you. But you should know I had a liking for your father. Well, your mother, too. They'll be good companions for you once you join us. Why would I join you? I asked with a critical tone, seething with hatred barely contained just beneath my skin. Why? Why? Because I want you to. That's the simple truth. Stone replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I desire your residence. I want you to stick around for a while. Nessa chose you as well, and she has her own reasons. That's not convincing enough. I growled at him through clenched teeth. Astonishing, my own courage amazed me. Tell me the real reason, Stone. All right, you've got me, Stone said with good humor. You see, years ago, when your parents acquired that property, they didn't realize the true value it holds for me and my kind. There are catacombs beneath that estate that have been in my family for generations, going back so far you couldn't even fathom it. We've been absent for a long time, but now I'm back, and I want what's rightfully mine. It was never yours. Never. Nor was it your parents'. And it certainly didn't belong to anyone else who falsely held the deed. He sneered at the mere mention of the house and the surrounding lands. I sold most of the land, I mentioned. I know, you sold all the land to me, Stone replied. And now, my kind is infiltrating, taking over you humans one by one. Your parents could fill you in on the details later, but for now, I want you to say yes. Just say yes, and I'll make your death swift and painless. Resist, and you'll suffer for weeks before you join us. Who are us? I asked. It doesn't matter, Nessa said from directly behind me. All you need to know is we're not vampires. I burst into laughter at that, genuine amusement echoing in the dim room. Vampires? Seriously, you expect me to believe in vampires? No, Nessa clarified. I want you to understand that we are not vampires. But if it helps you comprehend, you can think of us as the undead in a strange way. Nessa, Stone grumbled in a warning tone. Well, my apologies, boss, she said and moved to my right side, standing by me. Instantly, I felt less cornered. You're out in the light, I observed. Light. I appreciate the light, Stone remarked. I also appreciate the sun, though I have to admit it slows me down a bit. I enjoy the nightlife. I like to dance. He sang the last part and grinned at me, his silver eyes gleaming maliciously. As I told you, Slick, we're not vampires, Nessa said wearily. Are you really that dense? Well, then, what are you, Stone? I asked. Ancient, Stone replied. Ancient and not something you want to mess with. So, are you in or out? Either way, let's get this started. He eagerly rubbed his hands together. Wait, I said. I want to speak with my parents first. No, not until afterward. I already made that clear, Stone replied evenly. I thought long and hard. I wanted to live. I desired life more than that beer I first ordered in this dreadful place. I wanted to return to my mundane job and my dull life, whatever it took. But if I couldn't have those things, I desperately wanted to preserve my life. I began to scan my surroundings, trying to find a way to escape. I was too far from the exit, and I doubted I could make it, but just as I contemplated escaping, a piercing scream echoed from the back room, high-pitched and dreadful, worse than nails on a chalkboard. I instinctively covered my ears. Glasses on the bar shattered, and both Stone and Nessa lost their focus on me. Damn it, Nessa said and left my side to run toward the back room. Would you silence them? Stone shouted after her. I didn't think, I just ran. I made a dash for the door and burst out into the bright sunlight, grateful for the intense light. Outside, there were no cars in the parking lot, so I sprinted at top speed, thankful for the hours spent in the gym. The red barn was 6 miles from the farm, and I knew I probably wouldn't make it, but I had to try. I pushed myself hard, my legs pumping, screaming at the effort. I didn't dare look behind me and was on the verge of stopping, on the brink of giving up, when I rounded the corner and spotted the farmhouse to the right, less than a quarter mile away. I had to reach it. I had to. I ran again as fast as I could, my strength waning rapidly, my heart pounding, my breath turning ragged. I made it to my small house, dashed inside, grabbed my wallet and passport, hastily packed some random clothes into a duffel bag, snatched my keys, and was back outside, heading for the barn, in less than 5 minutes. I wanted the truck. It wasn't great on gas, and it was well known locally, but I hoped it would be less recognizable to them. Whatever they were. The truck sputtered to life, and I sped out of the barn, flooring the pedal. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between me and the farmhouse, knowing I'd never be able to return but unable to mourn that loss at the moment. Somehow, I got lucky. Right now, I'm in Rio. Things have been relatively quiet. Stone and Nessa almost caught up with me in San Diego 2 months ago, but luck was on my side, and I managed to elude them once more. They're furious with me, and they won't give up, that much is evident. I don't know what will happen if they catch me, because they will, especially after I publish this. As I said, I'm in Rio right now, and I plan to stay in Rio. After 2 years of constantly looking over my shoulder, I'm utterly exhausted. Am I giving up? Not entirely. Well, maybe a little, I suppose. But, you see, the bottom line is, I want you all to understand that there are far worse things out there than debt, government conspiracies, and lab experiments. Worse than losing your mother and father and your home. You need to stay vigilant. You have to watch people. You have to watch for eyes that glow silver and in the dark of night and teeth as sharp as razor blades. Do I regret my life? Yes, somewhat. Do I know I could have achieved much more if it hadn't been for Nessa? I would have, too, even though I was fairly certain she would reject me. But apparently, she wanted me to make a move. That's why she and Stone have been pursuing me relentlessly for the past 27 months. She desires me, and she will leave no stone unturned to find me. Now, I realize it was my parents in the back room of the building in the woods, creating that cacophony to serve as a distraction so I could escape. At least, I think that's what happened. So, to my friends, I want to say I'm sorry. I know you may not believe me, and that's fine. It might be easier for you not to. I ran out of grief, but that's only partly true. I ran to save my life, and now I'm willing to die to save yours.